to everyone who's joining us on Zoom. We're so glad that you're able to make it, even if you can't be here in the room. We are delighted to be partnering tonight with the fantastic Young Conservative Network, many of whose founders are here with us this evening. They're a great bunch, and we're delighted to be partnering with them. For those who aren't familiar with our work, the Coalition for Global Prosperity started about 3.5 years ago, and our purpose is to bring together political, military, business, faith leaders who believe that a development budget, leveraging British values and British expertise, really can change lives across the world and bring prosperity to those who need it most. And I'm delighted that several members of our coalition are in the audience here today. And there are very few people in British politics who have such a vast command of experience when we talk about diplomacy and defence and development than our esteemed guest who's here today. The Right Honourable Dr. Liam Fox has served as Defence Secretary under the Coalition. He was the Secretary of State for International Trade under Theresa May. He served in the Treasury and the Foreign Office under John Major, and he served as the Conservative Party Chairman in opposition. Dr. Fox, we are absolutely delighted to have you with us today.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a great thrill to get to speak to real people in real life rather than TV screens, although you do have to be dressed on top and bottom, which you don't have to do for Zoom. But thank you, and it's a very interesting topic. By way of introduction, I thought I'd just say where I'm coming from politically. When I was traveling with David Cameron, we were going to Afghanistan, and we were talking about the Conservative Party, and he said, I regard myself as a liberal Conservative, Liam. How do you regard yourself? And I thought, well, this could be a career-defining response. And I said, well, I regard myself as an unreconstructed, free market, Thatcherite, unionist, Eurosceptic Atlanticist. And so that just gives you an idea of where the direction of the answers are going to come from to any of your questions. I've always wondered why it is that politicians, as opposed to business, don't like the concept of globalization very much, and politicians don't much care for globalization. I think the answer lies in the fact that it inevitably brings a sense of loss of sovereignty, that you don't have complete control of events, that different influences are operating around the world. We've been taught a very good lesson on globalization by the pandemic. Pre-pandemic, at any one instant, you've got about 1.27 million passengers in the air and about 2 million people at sea. So when something like a new microorganism gets out there, it's already seeded before we can do anything about it. We had the same warnings with the global financial crash, with the Asian financial contamination. All of these have taught us that the concept of over there is increasingly redundant, because what's over there today will be over here tomorrow in one form or another, and we're coming up to the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and I don't need to tell you what that means in terms of our shared threats. So we have to think about the world in a very different way, in a way that I think business has embraced more than politics, and we've got some catching up to do in terms of the structures of government and how we integrate how we do business. So as we go post-Brexit into our global Britain posture, I think that we need re-engineering of Whitehall. I think we need to think of ourselves in a very different way and think of the world around us in a very different way if we are to have the sort of impact that I would like us to see. And I think the other thing that we need to remember is that how the world is perceived is very different from what it was in previous generations. When I was running for the World Trade Organization Director General, I made the argument all the time that there is a very, very strong link now between prosperity and trade on one hand and security on the other. Because unlike previous generations, right across the developing world, you go to Africa, young people can see the world on their mobile phone, and you get better reception, let me tell you, in Uganda than you do in North Somerset. And so the idea that they won't see what prosperous, stable countries look like is a myth. And if we are unable to offer people in the developing parts of the world the promise of security and the elements of prosperity and stability that we take for granted, do not be surprised if you end up with more mass migration or more political radicalization. We've got to understand that in the era of globalization, we need to ensure that the benefits of free markets and all the things that we've taken for granted that have given us the prosperity we have today, we have to make them much more available in these other parts of the globe. Otherwise, people will take, as the American administration is discovering, actions into their own hands to get a slice of it for themselves. And we would do well to understand this, about the realities of the world in which we find ourselves, before we pontificate a little too much about what everyone else ought to be doing. So that's my opening thoughts, maybe my only thoughts, in fact. But
Great, thank you very much. I know that our audience members, not just in the room but online, will be eager to fire you questions on lots of different topics. So perhaps we can open it up. Could you give us your broad reflections on some of the big challenges facing the UK and the West? And that's a very big question, but
yeah, how long have you got?
We'll dive in a bit more detail, I'm sure.
Well, I mean, the first issue, the first duty of government is security. We've just become a lot less secure than we were a few weeks ago. Having invested very heavily in lives and limbs and money in Afghanistan, we were forced to stand back and watch while 5,000 of our most vicious, committed, capable enemies walked free from Bagram prison. And that was the place that most of our dangerous enemies had been put during the course of the events in Afghanistan. And I haven't said a great deal about Afghanistan, partly because I've just been so angry about it. And what I saw was a complete betrayal of the elected Afghan government into the hands of the Taliban by the Trump administration, and then a bad policy being applied incompetently by the current American administration. Why you, knowing that you're going to leave a country, you would not take the trouble to be able to take your arms and complex weapons with you is quite beyond me. And why you would do it at the height of the fighting season while the Taliban were at their strongest, rather than in the winter when they have gone back to their tribal homeland. So we are less secure than we were, and it will go down as a major, major mistake in global security policy. So that's for starters. And then we've got the emergence of instability in other parts around the world, driven by a whole range of things, from political ideology to shifts in commodity availability. And we need to try and understand the sources of that instability if we're to try to deal with it. And I'm not sure we are yet very good at that. Our inability to predict where instability is coming from is often, I think, because we make a wrong analysis of the situation. I'll give you a concrete example of that. Is when I was Defense Secretary, I believed that our response to the Arab Spring was wrong. And I believed it was wrong because our analysis of the problem was wrong. We wanted, or certain people wanted, to interpret what was happening in North Africa at that time as a spontaneous uprising of people to get access to Western-style democracy. In fact, it was nothing of the sort. It was a commodity-driven crisis. There had been food price shocks in 2008 and 2010, and they actually drove prices to a level that went beyond the ability of their governments to subsidize them from overseas aid. So it wasn't a surprise that that crisis began with a fruit and veg seller setting himself on fire in Tunisia. There were elements in Western liberal democracies that wanted to see it as these are people now rising up to get a share of Western-style liberal democratic freedom. It wasn't. And our failure to understand the cause of the instability led us, in my view, to make a wrong assessment of the reasons for it, and then to blunder into a conflict for which we had no clear exit strategy. So making that assessment, I guess I go back to pretty much everything from my own professional training, which is, as a doctor, it's generally advisable to take your time to come to a good diagnosis before you start to think about what the treatment might be. It would be nice to think that that applied a lot more in politics than it sometimes seems to.
I find that absolutely fascinating. I read Barack Obama's his first memoir, and he talks about the debate that raged between his advisors around the time of the Arab Spring. So it's fantastic to get that insight. Let's stick with Afghanistan. How damaging is the perception that the UK and the West and NATO have been defeated? And what's the impact on that, or what is the impact for China and Russia?
Well, the first thing is not to be too UK-centric about it. This was a policy made in Washington, and there was very little we could do about it. The Americans were so overwhelmingly the lead force in Afghanistan. That's element number one. Number two is, could NATO have backfilled on the 2,500 US troops or the logisticians? Probably not, because here for me is the great hypocrisy, especially with some of our European allies when it comes to defence. They won't spend money on defence. They won't create capability that would allow them to have either a greater voice within NATO or act independently, and yet they complain more and more that they're having to ride on America's coattails. Well, you can't have it both ways. If you won't spend money on having an independent defence posture, you're going to be more dependent on the US acting within NATO. So when I was Defence Secretary, Robert Gates, it was my American counterpart, we used to do this sort of double act at NATO summits. It was sort of bad cop and worse cop. And he would give both barrels on the basis that you've got to stop expecting American taxpayers to pay 4.5% of their GDP on defence so that you can be high-spending, big-state European countries. And that pattern has really continued to the point where it was always going to be inevitable that the Americans would become frustrated with Europe not paying its full share. Only I think three now NATO members this year will meet the 2% of GDP on defence that they're meant to spend. How would you feel if you were a US taxpayer having to foot the bill for that, and then having all the complaints that you weren't being consulted properly on policy? I mean, so we need to be realistic about that. Having said that, as I said, I think it was to hand over, against the wishes of a democratic government, their state to effectively what was a terrorist organization is just unforgivable. How will it be viewed? Well, first of all, I think there are problems within NATO, because the view was we all went in together in Afghanistan. We all fought, we died together, and the agreement was we would all come out together. But the Americans decided to do that unilaterally. There will inevitably, therefore, be elements inside the thinking of other NATO partners outside the United States. Well, will they do that again if we go into action with the United States? Will they pull out unilaterally against our wish or against even our knowledge? So that is, it's done something inside NATO, so the internal dynamics, I think, are more shaky. Undoubtedly, it will be perceived as weakness, and that will be particularly true in Moscow, in Beijing, and Tehran, the three places where it matters the most. And I think you'll see Russia increasingly prodding NATO in what I used to describe when I was Defence Secretary as the arc of instability that they build around NATO, from the high north in the Arctic into the Baltic states, down into the Balkans, and then down into the Caucasus. The obvious place for them to prod the moment is the high north, to see what air defences look like up in the Arctic, and Ukraine. And I think if I were to put money on who's the biggest loser in all of this, I'd say in the short term the Ukrainians, because the Russians will be thinking that we would not respond were they to increase their activity further in Ukraine. And of course now we've got Nord Stream 2 just about to come on stream, which weakens the Ukrainian position further. In Britain, we had big scandals about people spending money on their duck houses that caused people to resign. In Germany, Chancellor Schroeder signed up to Nord Stream 2, left office, took a seat on the Gazprom board, adopted 2 Russian children, and you don't read much in Der Spiegel about that. So I think it has left us vulnerable, because I think it now allows Russia to cut off gas to Eastern Europe without cutting it off to their main business client in Germany. And I think it leaves Germany strategically as the soft underbelly of NATO in Northern Europe. I hate to say that, but I'm afraid that's where I think we are. In terms of Beijing, I think the next biggest losers are Taiwan, who will be wondering whether the West has the will to defend the values it's so happy to talk about, but not be so keen to protect. And thirdly, I think the instabilities in the Gulf, where I think an Iranian regime, which you thought couldn't get any worse, with the election of their new president, actually managed to get worse. And so I think in all of those areas of potential conflict, any of which we could be drawn into, I think have got more dangerous. So it's not just the potential of an Al-Qaeda type attack directly on us. It's the fact that our interests and our allies will have been shaken. So it gives me no pleasure to give you any part of that answer, but I think we've got to be brutally honest about what the implications of Afghanistan have been on our wider security.
I'm going to come to questions in a few minutes, so please begin thinking about what you'd like to ask. My next question is in two parts. First of all, should the decision by the Biden administration be seen as a one-off? This is the president fulfilling the pledge he made during the election, or is it part of a more inward-looking, isolationist American foreign policy? And related to that, if that is the case, given the UK has parted ways with the EU, where should the UK look for its alliances to tackle some of the challenges that we've spoken about?
Well, I think both of those are relatively easy. Number one is actually a more isolationist posture is normal American positioning. The times where America is outward-looking and globalist has been the exception in its recent history. We tend to think of the Reagan era when actually taking a more introspective view has been over the past century the norm in American policy. What tends to happen is America says, actually, we want fewer foreign interventions. We don't want to have Americans serving overseas. And then American interests are threatened by those very forces overseas, and America has to respond. There's sort of a cycle there. 9/11 was the last cycle in that. And so we're sort of at the end of the last one. So do I think it's a one-off? Well, I think it's the end of this cycle, very possibly to be repeated at other points in the future. I can understand why Americans don't want to be the global policeman. But frankly, if you're the world's biggest economy, you'll be more affected by what's happening out there in the global economy ultimately than most. And if you're the world's biggest military, and remember the American military budget is bigger than the next 11 in the world put together. That's China and Russia and Britain and Saudi Arabia and France and so on for the next 11 countries. It's an enormous military budget. And so with that level of spend comes some sort of global role, unless you want to have completely wasted that money on over-the-top national defense rather than international intervention capability. What should we do? We should stick with the United States. The United States is our strongest and best partner. Who else are we going to do? Or if you've got the choice of the country that's got the biggest budget than the next 11 put together, or some small European country that doesn't have any capability or spends 90% of its defense budget on wages, really not much of a toss-up for the UK. The United States remains our best and our strongest ally. And while there might be a temptation post-Afghanistan to be irritated by that decision and to pull back a little bit, that would be the wrong response. Our response should be to redouble our political contacts with the United States. I think for the Conservative Party, we've had far too little interaction with our Republican colleagues in recent years. We should be helping guide them back to a more outward-looking, free market, electable Republican Party, recognizing that we are sister parties in the International Democratic Union and working with them, which is why I've taken up the chairmanship of the Conservative Friends of America. I intend to work very hard at strengthening that relationship because I am in absolutely no doubt that that is the most important bilateral relationship, security relationship, and economic relationship that the United Kingdom has or will have in the foreseeable future.
I'm going to come to the audience.
Hope that was clear.
I'm going to come to the audience next, but my final question is, You spoke at the beginning, Dr. Vox, about prosperity and Africa, and we have two former ambassadors in the room who have served as UK ambassadors on the continent. But how important is international development in helping achieve the UK's trade and defence and diplomatic objectives, particularly as we cast our eye over to Africa and the developing world?
Well, and security objectives, as I say. In this world, if you don't give people a chance at prosperity and stability that they can see elsewhere, they're going to move to try and get it. And so it's in everybody's interest to get that, that stability. Now, I've been quite critical of the way that we've carried out some of these policies. I think, for example, we need to spend a lot more time thinking about outward direct investment from the UK. Because if you think about it, in terms of trade, our shelves are stacked full of the sort of service capabilities that developing economies need, whether those are legal services, financial services, life sciences, whatever. We need developing countries to have better access to those sorts of services so that they can increase the capability and capacity of their economies. It makes them less dependent on us in terms of our overseas aid. It gives them the ability to be sustainably prosperous. It also, for us, gives us a market to sell into and potentially a market to shape for the future benefits of the United Kingdom. So for me, it's an absolute no-brainer. The trade agenda, the investment agenda, and the development agenda go hand in hand, and we haven't quite got them all coordinated. We're in danger of them running on parallel tracks rather than on diverging tracks at the present time. And I think, for example, we need to do a little bit of re-education about economics, because when I talked about how outward direct investment was important to the UK, I was accused of, quote, exporting British jobs. Well, I'm not sure which sort of bizarre textbook in economics that comes from, because if you only have inward direct investment, it will count as a positive flow in your current account in year one. But if you're an open country like we are and dividends flow overseas, in every year after that, it'll become a negative flow in your current account. You've got to counterbalance it with investments that you've made overseas that will return financial flows to us. It seems to me that does not exactly require a Mensa membership in economics to grasp that. We still seem to have failed to put those together in terms of our foreign economic development and trade policy. So there's some work still required on that, which is a tremendous opportunity, because if you look at the areas where we do export services, places like the Gulf, which is our third biggest export market after the United States and Europe, we are exporting a lot of service capabilities there, which are actually providing Britain with a great influence in those regions, and we could learn from that and do it far more. And Africa is going to be a huge middle-class market by 2050. It'll be the world's biggest, probably, middle-class market by then. And they will be hungry for the sort of things that we've got to sell. Why do we have such a problem marrying up that quite obvious economic opportunity that is coming with what we already have to sell in terms of the skills that they will need? So I think part of the problem is that we've not always seen trade and investment as two sides of the same coin, which I believe they are, and which our Whitehall re-engineering needs to take into account to make it successful.
Thank you very much. Right, questions. Who would like to go first? Yes, thank you very much. If you wait for the microphone, and if you could stand up and say who you are, that'd be great.
Yeah, when we used to do this at Department for International Trade, I used to say, stand up, tell us who you are, how long you've worked here, and how long you would like to work here.
Okay, thank you, sir. My name is William, and I'm a student of Politics International Relations. And I would like to ask you about some question about Afghanistan. So one, I just received the news about the Taliban is now, they have the interim government of one of the interior minister that he's wanted by the FBI. So I would like to know about what would the UK do next about the Taliban. And two, like, do you think that with what's happening in Afghanistan, do you think you can consider as a false Saigon in 75? Like what happened in 1975 in false Saigon in South Vietnam? And the third question about China, what do you think about the Belt and the Road Initiative? Because the thing about that one is quite concerning about the world, about how China is going to be a superpower in the world. And I would like to know about what your thought about this. Thank you.
Well, they're good questions. I don't think it's like the fall of Saigon. In Saigon, we didn't sign it away voluntarily before we had to. And I think this was much more a surrender than anything else in Afghanistan. And I think it will be something of a stain on the reputation of those who took that decision, particularly, I think, in Washington. Belt and Road is an interesting and not all one-sided strategic view that the Chinese take. Let's go back to the aims. I take the view that China has a very clear worldview. China wants to make the world a more permissive place for totalitarian regimes and this nonsensical oxymoron called state capitalism. You can't have state capitalism. You can have state control or you can have capitalism. You can't have state capitalism. I think it's a nonsense. China wants to do that. We need to respond not by being transactional. Every time China does something, we try to do the opposite. We need to have our own worldview. We need to try to make the world a more permissive place for democratic states who believe in the rule of law and liberty. And that requires us to have a much more proactive global foreign policy. The West, I mean, in general, not just us, than we have had. Having said that, it's not all going perfectly smoothly for China with Belt and Road. First of all, you go to a lot of countries in Africa, the local population don't get the benefit of employment because the Chinese tend to bring their own workforce. They tend to have a lot of shoddy workmanship. I've visited countries in Africa where they already have a big debt that they owe to China for their infrastructure, which is already falling apart. And they're going to have to pay again to put back in place. So it's not altogether successful. But we're not clear, I don't think, about how we will counter that Chinese activity. And then there are other areas as we go into COP26. There's the question about what do you do about China and carbon. So if China doesn't price carbon into any of the products it sells, and it pollutes very heavily in order to produce cheap manufactured goods, what do we do about that? Can we persuade China to price carbon in under Article 6 at COP26, or do we have to price it in ourselves at the borders by a carbon border mechanism of some sort, including a carbon border tax? So there are a lot of big issues going to be thrown up in all of this, and we will be challenged to show our mettle in our response to all of this. And I think that when I wrote a book back in 2013, I was still saying back then, is China a threat or is it a great opportunity? And I think my view then would have been that the jury's out. After Hong Kong, the jury's not out. There can be no question of the direction of travel of China now.
Next question, Miles. Sir Miles, I should say.
No, please don't, Ryan. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the presentation. I thought you came up with some really interesting facts and figures, particularly the number of people on aeroplanes and boats. So this issue around pandemics and health and global issues. Global issues are really important: health, climate change, etc., etc. And I would, a number of us have argued, in the context of global Britain, that we need to focus on a proper defence expenditure, proper development expenditure, proper diplomatic expenditure, proper soft power expenditure. And I just wondered what your view was on the cut from 0.7% to 0.5% on international development, because it seems to me, at least, that undermines that whole notion of global Britain, which is where a lot of us, I'm sure including you, want to be? And I'd just be really interested to get your views on it. Thank you.
Well, I was never in favour of having the 0.7 target, to be frank with you, because I knew in my time in office that we were finding projects to spend money on just to reach the 0.7%. I would much rather you set out what it is you want to buy first, rather than setting out the budget and then trying to spend it. So I was never in favour of that. I think setting out what you want to achieve from a development plan is more important. And I actually answered for development issues in the Commons in John Major's government, which is way before most of this audience were born. You know, then actually we had a much more focused program on specific aid programs that we would look at, rather than giving countries money and getting them to choose how to spend it. I actually favour a much more focused approach to aid. But I go back, if I may, to my previous point, that having an aid policy that isn't actually tied into your environmental policy and that isn't tied into your trade and investment policy is actually going to be suboptimal. It's not necessarily to say that they're synergistic if you do them together, although I think they may well be. But let me give you an example. If we give countries money to spend on their economic development, but there are no strings attached on how they power up their economies, they're likely to power those economies with Chinese-built coal-fired power stations. And don't think it's beyond the wit of Whitehall to end up undermining our own national targets on carbon with our own taxpayers' money through our development budget. It's entirely possible, which is what I mean by bringing them together. I would like to see, for example, if we're having those aid projects, that we're encouraging countries to grow their economies based on sustainable energy, and that we help them through our development policy buy some of that more expensive technology to enable that to happen. It's what I mean about joining them up. So I think that you can be led into these debates about is 0.7 better than 0.6, better than 0.5, or is 0.8 better than 0.7, when we really should be focusing a lot more on what are the aims of that policy, what do we do with it? And on your point about global, I mean, apologies to Freddie from my office at the back, who's so sick of me saying this, but global issues need to be dealt with on a global basis. Global issues cannot be dealt with by national capitals on their own. However big they are, however rich they are, however powerful they are, they need to be dealt with on a global basis. The pandemic, we had adequate warnings. We had SARS, which was not very deadly and not very easily spread. We had MERS, which was very deadly, but not very easily spread. Now we've had COVID-19, which is not that deadly, but very easily spread. Someday we're going to get the worst of both. And we better learn from this pandemic to deal with it a lot better than we have. And what we need are global protocols and global metrics. We can't even agree how to measure the death rate from the current pandemic from country to country, never mind how to put global protocols in place. And frankly, I don't think the WHO is up to it. I think you'll see the second coming before you'll see the WHO put protocols in place that will adequately deal with a future pandemic. But we have to find ways to do that. Now, this is the doctor in me. This is a bit of my hobby horse, but you know, what will we think of in 50 years' time about this pandemic? We will think that it led us to the technology of RNA vaccines. It proved in extremis, we had to prove that we could do it, and we did do it. It's like we think back to 1934, that's the invention of antibiotics, the discovery of antibiotics, more than anything else. If we have got the ability, and the Americans, remember, created a vaccine within a week of learning the genome for COVID-19, if we've got the ability to do this, what do we need to do? We need to have global centers where we can produce vaccines as soon as we know the new genome of any new pathogen, be able to produce it quickly, distribute it quickly, and have genuine protocols looking at things like the case fatality rate of a new pathogen, and be able to act in concert quite quickly. We're a long way from that. And here we are still with a rolling global pandemic. And I think just as we didn't really learn a lot of lessons from the financial crash in 2009, as far as I can see, we've not yet fully learned our lessons from the 2019 pandemic. And we know what they are, so there's really no excuse for failing should it come around again.
Yes, sir. Front row.
Hi. So you made a very good point about the vaccine. So how does a government, for example, Britain's, be able to balance its need to vaccinate its own population versus supplying vaccines to developing countries? So lots of countries in Africa are currently struggling to vaccinate their population, and that's going to cause an even bigger problem going in the future.
You make sure that you don't have to make a choice in the future. That's what you do. You make sure that you've got the ability to manufacture vaccine in a range of global centers quickly and at scale. And the thing is, we've got the ability to do it. And if any of you are interested in looking at pandemic, there's a wonderful paper by an American researcher called Hatcher. In 2008, this paper came out, and it looked at the 1918 flu outbreak in the United States, where there's more data than anywhere else. And it looked at 17 cities across 19 parameters of lockdown, length of lockdown, how early it happened, how severe it was, and so on. And what it showed was early lockdown in a pandemic will reduce your peak death rate by about 50%. But over time, it has much less and less effect as the population has to mix. Unless, of course, you've got either a cure or a vaccine. And so we can apply that data. If we've got global protocols, we will know how to slow it until we've got time to get production at scale. The RNA technology that we have now enables us to do that. Once we've got once we can express a genome, it's not our technical ability now that's the rate limiting step. It's our ambition, and that's where we've got to step up to the plate. And we will have the technical ability to do it. All the more guilt, I think, would sit on our shoulders, knowing we had the ability to do it, but we hadn't made the planning for next time. And in a pandemic like that, of course, the pathogen will spread through a population that's not been exposed to it, unless it either reaches a level of herd immunity or it gets something like a vaccine. And I was explaining to some MPs in the tea room how viral mutations occur. I was having a bit of trouble, I have to say, explaining RNA technology. But anyway, what I did say was, if I gave you a table of 1,000 numbers and asked you to copy it 100 times, how many mistakes do you think you'd make? And that's it. So the wider a virus spreads geographically, and the longer an outbreak goes on, the more it will replicate, and the more variations and mistakes it will make in replication. And therefore, we're not all safe until everyone is safe. And that's why it is a global problem. It cannot be dealt with on a national basis. Unless, of course, you want to do a New Zealand and never allow your people to mix with the rest of the world until it's actually gone away everywhere else. And that's just not realistic.
Let's take a question from one of our members online, and then I'll come to Samantha. So we have a question from Rajan, who may like to ask his question live. So I will pause for a few seconds to give him the opportunity.
Hello.
Please go ahead.
Hello, Mr. Fox. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah. We can't see you're a disembodied voice.
I'd like to ask you that you've just joined the Conservative Friends of America. What are your goals for this organization, and how do you see it progressing in the future?
Well, as I say, I think that it's important that we hold the United States close. It's very important at a time when our values, as well as our security, will be questioned, not least as a result of what's happened in Afghanistan. It's very important that we build the political links. When I was a young MP, we had a lot of political contacts with our opposite numbers in Congress. That has withered over time, and that's not healthy for two of the world's most important democracies. We should know one another better. We should have much closer conversations. And I'm delighted to say that in Washington, Paul Ryan, the former speaker, has taken up the invitation to be my opposite number in Washington, which I think gives us considerable increased firepower and credibility as we start to rebuild these relationships. I want us to be in a position where we influence other of Western democracies, that we start to think very carefully about who we are and why we are who we are. We didn't get to our position today by accident. We got there because we have a belief in freedom, we have a belief in rule of law, we have a belief in democracy. All of these things are very permissive to an innovative culture. We did not become the world's richest, most successful countries by mistake or by accident. We did it because the things that we believe in are conducive to that outcome. And if we believe that that's what led to where we are, we should want it to continue for future generations, and we should want it to extend it to other parts of the world. So I really do believe that we have a mission to export the very things that we too often take for granted. We have to make sure that the United States is in the same place as we are, because I think America is still a force for good in the world. And I think that an America that believes in free trade, that believes in defending freedom where it's threatened, is a very good partner for the United Kingdom. So I want to rebuild some of that we've lost, and I want to raise our ambitions, because I think when Britain and America stand together with the same global ambitions, we are a tremendous global force. And sometimes we're a bit too apologetic for the things that we have achieved in the past.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Sam first.
Hi, thank you very much for taking my question. I'm Samantha Johnson, the Director of Global Trade at GSK. You mentioned a couple of times about re-engineering in Whitehall. Obviously, within the recent year, we've seen the formation of the FCDO between Department for International Development and the Foreign Office, and we've also seen the integrated review. And I wondered if we could hear your reflections on that development within the Whitehall structures, whether there should be other departments that are more integrated when you've spoken about kind of environment and trade and investment, and where that should be going to achieve the Global Britain agenda.
Yes, thank you. It's a great question. So I think that actually what you need is much more cross-departmental working. I think we've seen some good appointments. Lord Grimstone, Jerry Grimstone, for example, at the Department for International Trade and BAYS is a great example of where you need to have high-level coordination. I think there needs to be much more cross-cabinet committee working in some of these areas. I think number 10 needs to take charge of some of these areas. And I think it also needs to be replicated in what we do overseas. Just doing it in London is not going to work for us. We need to make sure that all these cooperations are happening overseas. Now, by our very good fortune, we tend to have overseas staff who will just do whatever task is given to them. And so they tend to see themselves less as being trade people, diplomatic people, aid people, and so on, and will do much more. But we are underpowered overseas. And I tell you that DFID, as was, had more people in Ethiopia than Department for International Trade had in the whole of Africa, from Cape Town to Cairo. It gives you an idea of the imbalance that is out there. So if we actually want to make this work, we've got to give ourselves the means to make it work. And that means getting Whitehall to think more holistically, but also replicating that overseas. And you cannot do Global Britain on a shoestring. And when I was in the Foreign Office in the 1990s, when we came back to office in the coalition in 2010, I could not believe how much the Foreign Office had been hollowed out. In the 90s, I took part in the peace agreement in Sri Lanka. And when we came back to office in 2010, I went to the Foreign Office and said, could you give me an update on how things are going? They said, well, sir, you've been there, we haven't. And if you want to have that influence, you've got to have the people on the ground who do it. And there's no point a country spending all its money on domestic consumption and then complaining that it doesn't have the international influence because it doesn't have the international footprint. So if we wish global Britain to be a reality, well, we do have to put our money where our mouth is, and we have hollowed out our overseas network too much. I probably shouldn't say, I won't say it. I know, just get me into trouble. You know, it's the old adage that the Treasury knows the price of everything and the value of nothing, has led to some of our worst decisions in terms of our overseas investments and our overseas estate over years. I regret that. And I put the blame very firmly on the Blair government, who did that to an unbelievable extent.
Just go, 3 rows from the front, just on my right. Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for being here. I've got 2 questions that are slightly connected. The first one is, do you think that in light of our recent withdrawal from Afghanistan, the UK, the US and NATO as a whole can be seen by by an unreliable ally? So to be, sorry, the UK, the US and our allies will be seen as an unreliable ally by our potential partners. And the second question is, in light of a less secure world in the recent years, what do you think about the proposed cut to the troop numbers? Thank you.
Well, I think you mustn't obsess with any one element of the defence budget. The biggest threat that we face nowadays is what I used to describe as the war on the invisible enemy, the war in cyberspace and space. The Chinese didn't shoot down their first satellite to prove to themselves that they could do it. They did it to prove to us that they could do it. It was a warning at a time when we said we mustn't have the militarization of space. Space had already been militarized. And in the era of electronic communications, I remember saying to the American Secretary of the Navy, I said, you know, what a fabulous thing the Pacific Fleet is. But not if it doesn't know where it is. And how many of your commanders can navigate by sextant rather than GPS. And so there are questions, and I used to explain this to my service chiefs, because the service chiefs never want to cut what they can see and inspect to have a capability that they can't see. And it's a hard sell to the military, but very often that's where our vulnerability actually lies. And to have no technology leaves you, of course, with no risk to that technology. As you progress, you probably get to a point of greatest security, and then the greater your technology becomes, probably your risk starts to move up again, unless you're willing to take mitigation measures on that. We were slow, I think, to see some of the risks in cyberspace. Yeah, we're not slow to see them now. If people had any concept of just how their well-being is threatened in cyberspace every hour of every day, I think they'd be urging us to be spending even more of our defense budget on that. Do I think that it has shaken NATO? Yes, I think probably. I think it's given us a bit of a shake internally. I think it's done a bit of damage to reputation externally. Is it irreversible? Absolutely not. I think we do need to take a long, hard look at our alliance and see where our threats come. And I think one of the problems with NATO is that NATO has tended to think in the late 20th century mindset that its threats come from its geographical locality, rather than understanding that we are as vulnerable to attacks from Chinese cyberspace as we are from Russian cyberspace, and protect ourselves accordingly. So a lot of rethink and a lot of challenge to what I know are deeply held institutional values in our armed forces. But you know, we need to think about what the threats are today and what the threats are in the future, not what they were in the past, and invest in the capabilities we'll need in the future.
The next question, just at the front. Thank you very much. And we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'll come to Zander immediately afterwards.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fox, for taking...
They're never 100%, are they?
Sorry.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fox, for taking my question today, and my thanks to the Young Conservative Network and the Coalition for Global Prosperity for hosting such a brilliant event so far. And can I also commend you for the amazing work you've done for the Conservative Friends of America group. Like yourself, I'm a big believer in the special relationship between the United States and the UK. But I do believe it has been damaged, and especially with recent events in Afghanistan, I think it has been damaged quite significantly. So with the US now becoming an arguably less reliable ally, do you think that the UK should start pursuing other free trade agreements, in particular the Kanzuk agreements, which has received bilateral support on both sides of the House of Commons and has also received support from Canada, New Zealand and Australia? And I just wanted to get your views on Kanzuk in general.
Before we, if it's all right, we'll go to Zander too, just so we can get them in. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Zander Woolcombe. I work with the Eleanor Crook Foundation. You talked a lot about leadership and the need for international leadership, and yet you've also sort of hinted that there doesn't seem to be enough of it. And I just wondered if you could explain why. You know, the UK is hosting the G7 this year. We're hosting the COP meeting. You're talking about divergent paths between development and trade and diplomacy. But you know, this government's been in office for 11 years, and we just had an integrated review, which is meant to be addressing this. So why aren't we having that leadership, and where's it going to come from? And then just with regard to your work with America, do you think the Americans do a better job of integrating those different pieces of the 3Ds as they're known, and how does that sort of fit into what you're trying to do with members of Congress?
So no, I from my own experience, no, I don't think they tend to do it much better than we do. I think everyone's still. I think we're still at a point where, in the era of globalization, governments still think in the West in general, still think in a very siloed way, in the way that they always have, without putting the bits of the puzzle together and recognizing that they're massively overlapping. And you can't disaggregate these problems in perhaps a way that you could even when I worked in the Foreign Office in the 90s, although I think it was even limited then. So no, I do think it is. And I think if you look at what we say we want and what we're actually doing, they're not always the same thing. So I'll give you a good example is global trade. At the end of the financial crisis in 2009, only 0.7% of all the G20 countries' imports were covered by restrictive measures, either tariffs or non-tariff measures. By the first quarter of 2020, it was 10.3%. So we've had a massive increase in protectionism from the G20 countries. Now, this is at a time when we are increasing our aid, when we are trying to do much more in terms of our environmental policy, but all the time that we're giving with one hand, we're building restrictions with the other, a little bit of environmental legislation here, a bit of consumer protection here, a little bit of producer protection over there, and it becomes cumulative. Global trade was slowing before we got to the pandemic. I mean, we're going to have to face this on the other side of it because the rich countries were trying to coordinate their policies on one direction on one hand, but we're still putting up these barriers on another. If you're an NGO, if you're an SME in a developing country, you've now got pretty insurmountable barriers to get into the markets of the world's richest countries. And remember, the G20 countries make up 90% of global trade and about 95% of global GDP. That's a hell of a lot of barrier to get across. So we have to ask ourselves some pretty hard questions about whether we're actually frustrating our own aims by policies in different places. And the Americans, I'm afraid, have been right at the front of that in terms of protectionism in recent years. Do I think that the special relationship is weaker? Well, first of all, I would go back to what the special relationship is. When Winston Churchill first talked about the special relationship, it was in the speech at Fulton, Missouri, which is better remembered for using the term Iron Curtain for the first time. And Churchill, in that speech, was talking as a world leader, a war leader, somebody who understood the interactions of armed forces, of training, of munitions, and so on. And it was only later on, I think, that special relationships started to get this emotional Disney-esque hue, particularly in the Thatcher-Reagan era. It is a hard-headed relationship based largely on intelligence, primarily on intelligence, and secondly, on security capability. There is no relationship in security closer than the United States and the UK. And ultimately, that relationship is more important than the relationship between any two political parties on either side of the Atlantic or the personal chemistry between any two leaders on either side of the Atlantic. And sometimes earlier in an administration or a UK government, and sometimes later, that inevitable truth dawns on them. And we're safer when it happens earlier rather than later.
We are almost exactly on the hour, so I'm afraid we will have to leave it there. Before I thank our guest, let me thank you all so much for being with us, for braving the first, one of the first hybrid events or in-person events. Thank you to everyone who's online. I'm looking around, but I know you can see me, even if I can't see you. Please do stay and join us for a glass of wine, if you can. And finally, thank you so much to the Young Conservative Network, particularly Ethan Palmer, who's been a tremendous help to our team. And very finally, Dr. Liam Fox, thank you so much for your time and for giving us so much to think about. Thank you.
Yeah. And can I say a very big